In the previous video, we discussed the introduction of soil mechanics. We looked at its application and in situations where we'll be needing soil. This brings us to soil formation, where we are going to discuss how soils are being formed and in which situations are we going to meet what are we going to come across soil. So soil is any uncemented or weakly cemented aggregate of what of minerals formed by weathering of what of rocks. So when I have a rock, we know that rocks are what aggregates of what of minerals. So minerals like quartz, biotite, amphibole. So let's say when I have a rock consisting of several what? Several minerals. This rock tends to undergo weathering. So when this rock is being what? When this rock is being weathered, uncemented or weakly cemented aggregates of these minerals form. And this is what we term as what? As soil. So soils are products of weathering. Soils Soils are products. They are products of weathering. Soils are products of weathering. Soil formation is important to predict. Mm. Why is formation important to the engineer or the geologist or even well, the civil engineer? So studying soil, how soil is being formed, helps us what predict the engineering behavior of soil. So we are able to predict the engineering behavior of soil. That's how a soil is going to behave under the influence of load or when water flows through it. So when I let's say this is the ground with soil, right? The ground with soil. When I load this soil, with let's say a house, the the mode of formation of this soil helps predict how this engineering structure, which is the house, will how the mode of formation of this soil will help predict the engineering behavior of the soil. That's how the soil will be able to respond to the load, or if water tends to seep through the soil, how would the soil behave? Moreover, knowledge of soil forming process helps engineering classification of the soil. So every soil can be what? Can be classified. Every soil classified, can be classified. As such, when we know how the soil is being formed, we'll be able to classify the soil. Weathering. Soils are so initially I did mention that soils are products of what? Of weathering. What then is weathering? Soils are formed through a process known as weathering, the disintegration or alteration of rocks to form smaller fragments. So if I have a rock, then this rock is being disintegrated into smaller rocks, into smaller rocks. So I have these large rocks, and this large rock is being disintegrated into smaller rock fragments. That process is termed as weathering. That process is termed as weathering. So with weathering, we have two types. We have the mechanical weathering and the physical weathering. The mechanical weathering is also known as disintegration. So let's talk about mechanical weathering. So mechanical breakdown of rocks into smaller fragments. If you don't see mechanical weathering, what you see physical weathering, or what we call this disintegration. Disintegration. So mechanical weathering is the same as physical weathering or disintegration. So this is the breakdown of rocks into smaller fragments by agents. And some of these agents is what is being listed below. That's water, glacier, wind, thermal expansion and contraction, freestyle, and gravity. How do these agents tend to affect weathering or tend to help in the breakdown of rocks? Let's discuss them. Let's discuss them into detail. So these are coarse grains, soils, cohesionless cobbles, gravels. Let's discuss them into detail. How does water how does water aid in mechanical weathering? So water carries sediments and rock particles, especially in rivers and streams, or even what any water body with high energy. As these particles move, they collide with each other, they scrap against each other and gradually producing what sediments. What this means is that as water moves, so let's say, let me use this as what movement, the movement of water. As water moves, it carries sediment, right? As water moves, it carries sediment. This sediment tends to collide with each other. They tend to collide with each other. Upon collision, they scrap each other. So the rocks tend to scrap against each other, producing disintegrating. So when they scrap against each other, they tend to disintegrate and form smaller what sediments. This is how water affect or water aids in mechanical weathering. Now, how does glaciers help in mechanical weathering? So this happen in what? In two folds with glaciers. One we call it the plaking. So how does plaking occurs? How does plaking occurs? So as glacier moves over bedrock, it melts slightly at the base due to pressure. This meltwater penetrates cracks and joints in the bedrocks. So this is what we call so this is glacier, right? This is an image of a glacier. So as this glacier moves over bedrocks, they melt slightly at the base due to pressure. This meltwater penetrates into cracks. So let's say this glacier tends to melt, right, and form water under bedrocks. They seeps into the cracks of this bed rock, right? When they stick into the cracks of these bed rocks and joints, this is the process called plaking. So there is temperature, when temperature changes, they tend to freeze and also melt. This process tends to cause the disintegration of the bedrock. So affect. This is how glacier tends to affect or tends to. This is how glacier aids in mechanical weathering. Now, wind. Wind is also with the movement of wind. When the movement of wind aids in mechanical weathering, in what way? So, as the wind blows, it also tends to fragments, carry rock fragments. Just as water carry rock fragments in its movement. Wind also carries rock fragments in its movement, where it's so upon movement, these rocks tend to scrap against each other, forming what? Sediments. So this is how wind also aid in mechanical weathering. Now, thermal expansion and contraction. How does this aid in mechanical weathering? So when there is a rock, right? When there is a rock, as temperature as temperature changes, so those small, sorry, this those small temperature. So as temperature changes, the rock tends towards expand, it tends to expand and again contract. It tends to expand and contract. So the expansion and contraction over time tends to disintegrate. It tends to disintegrate the rock to form sediments. Freestyle. Does freestyle aid in mechanical weathering? So freestyle is also more like frost. Okay. So when I have a rock fragment again and there are joints, let's say joints or cracks, let me just say fractures in the rock fragments. As water seeps into the rock, when water seeps into the rock, right? As temperature changes, the water that has seeped into the rock tends to freeze or become frost. As the temperature decreases again, as temperature decreases, they tend to the frost tends to what? To melt. The frost tends to melt. So this happens over time. So the freezing and melting tends to disintegrate the rock, meaning that as anytime the water becomes frost, it increases in volume, right? So the increase and decrease in volume tends to disintegrate the rock. Now with gravity, so gravity tends to move larger rocks down. So you know that gravity tends to pull objects towards the earth, right? So let's say I have a mountain, and let's say there is a rock on the mountain. Gravity will tend to move this. Let me have this mountain, and there is a rock on the mountain. Gravity tends to pull this rock down. As this rock moves down, it scraps the side of the bedrock, disintegrating it. Or when this rock also moves down and falls to the ground, it tends to what? Disintegrate into sediment. So this is how these agents of mechanical weathering. We've talked about physical weathering, also known as disintegration or mechanical weathering. We also have chemical weathering, as stated earlier on. So chemical weathering, rainwater reacts with rainwater reacts with the minerals in rock to form new minerals. You made mention that rock is what? An aggregate of what? Of minerals. An aggregate of what? Of minerals. So water when water reacts with when water reacts with the rock, when water reacts with the minerals in the rock, new minerals are being what? Formed. So usually clay and chemical weathering usually yields what we will have what? Clays, right? Clays and soluble salts. And it's most rapid in tropical areas. When we say tropical areas, what we mean is rainfall and high temperatures. In areas where there are heavy rainfalls and high temperatures, we classify these areas as humid tropical areas. So usually in humid tropical areas, chemical weathering is more. So basically, chemical weathering takes place when water reacts with the rock, when water reacts with the rock and the minerals in the rock, there is a reaction between the minerals in the rock and the water to form new minerals. This is how this is what we describe as what? Chemical chemical work. What this means is that in here I made mention of clay. So what's something? So clay is a product. Clay is a product of chemical clay is a product of chemical weathering. Clay is a product of what? Of chemical weathering. Now, the mechanisms of chemical weathering, the mechanisms under chemical weathering, hydrolysis, oxidation, carbonation, dissolution. How does these aid in chemical weathering? Starting with hydrolysis. So in here, the hydrolysis the breakdown of rock by acidic water to produce what? To clay. And the minerals in here usually are feldspar, mica. So hydrolysis is the reaction of minerals with water. Water molecules tends to dissociate into hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions. Tends to dissociate into hydrogen ions and hydroxide, sorry, hydroxide ions, hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions, which then react with minerals. So, for example, feldspar minerals, for example, let's take an example. Feldspar minerals in feldspar minerals in granite, okay, feldspar minerals in granite will react with water to form clay minerals such as the kaolinites, okay. So we are saying that the minerals in the rock will alter to form other minerals, usually clay minerals or soluble salts. So when we have granite, let me take an example like granite. This is a rock. Granite is a rock, okay? So granite rock. Let me put it that way. Granite usually have feldspars. Feldspars. Granite usually have feldspars. So this feldspar in granite will alter to usually to form clay minerals such as the kaolinite. Dissolved ions, the kaolinite, dissolved ions will form kaolinite, dissolved ions, as well as silica, as well as silica. This reaction significantly weakens the rock and causes it to disintegrate. So this is how hydrolysis tends to aid in chemical weathering. Now, oxidation. Oxidation is is the breakdown of rocks by what oxygen and water, often giving iron-rich rocks a rusty colored what weathered what surface. So oxidation is what we usually refer to as what rusting. So in the oxidation, minerals will react with what with oxygen, a similar process like rusting of what of metals. So what happens is that iron-bearing minerals such as olivine, iron-bearing minerals such as olivine, iron-bearing minerals such as olivine, pyroxene, and biotite, such as olivine, pyroxene, and biotite react with oxygen to form iron oxides. So this will form iron oxides and hydroxides, such as hematite and limonite. So this reaction gives rocks a reddish, it gives the rocks a reddish or yellowish color and weakens the entire structure, the entire rock. That's how oxidation aids in chemical weathering. Solution. Removal of rock in solution by acidic water. The example being limestone being weathered by rainwater containing dissolved CO2. This process is sometimes called carbonation. So the solution is sometimes what's called what carbonation. So if you don't see solution and you see carbonation, basically we are referring to this. So carbonation of carbonation. Solution. Solution is the removal of rock. Another mechanism of chemical weathering is solution. That's the removal of rock in solution by acidic water. Example being limestone weathered by rainwater containing dissolved CO2. Now, this process, that solution, is sometimes called carbonation. It's sometimes called what's carbonation. It's called carbonation when limestone is what is involved. When limestone is involved, we can sometimes call this mechanism carbonation. There is another mechanism known as dissolution. Another mechanism known as dissolution. Dissolution is the process by which soluble minerals will dissolve in what? In water. So minerals such as halite, halite is what? Rock salt. Minerals such as halite and gypsum. Minerals such as halite and gypsum will dissolve readily in water. They will dissolve readily in water, leading to the gradual removal of these minerals from the rock. So another mechanism is dissolution. So you can add that to your notes. Basically, this is how soil is being what? Is being formed through wedging. We look at the types that physical and chemical wedging. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share in order to get notified anytime a video is being what? Is being uploaded. You can as well leave your reviews in the comment section. Let's have try work. Let's have try works, or let's say assignments. Let's have let's have try work or assignments. Okay, let me call it assignments. So you can try just as we did in the previous video. You can leave your answers in the comment section or any other means of which we provided. So the first question is list and explain. List and explain the types. List and explain the types of wedging. List and explain the types of wedging. Then you explain you explain three mechanisms. You explain each, three mechanisms each under the types of wedging. Three mechanisms each under the types of wedging. Explain three mechanisms each under the type of wedging. The third question is what type of wedging what type of wedging occurs usually what type of wedging occurs usually in the tropics? What kind of what the third question is what type of wedging occurs usually in the tropics? What type of wedging occurs usually in the tropics? So this will be so you can answer them and get yourself abreast with. You can answer them and make sure you get the answers right. See you in the next video. Enjoy.